Good morning. We're going to go back to where we were yesterday and pick up with the last part of Gerald Ford's presidency. We talked about this yesterday. We talked about the women's lib movement. So this is where we're going to pick up today, okay? Hope you're having a good day, getting ready for the end of the school year. I know we all are. Okay, so yesterday we talked about the fact that we had the Equal Rights Amendment, and we're going to get to more of that in just a minute. Equal rights for women. But a radical element of this movement was the women's lib movement, the women's liberation movement, where they saw marriage as a form of slavery. The idea that free love, that we should be able to sleep with whoever we wanted to, whenever we want to, that divorce laws should be easier on everybody. Lesbianism was an acceptable thing. All of these come out of the women's liberation movement. And of course, one of the major proponents of the women's lib movement was abortion on demand. And we talked about this yesterday, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but we know Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973, and it said that most state laws that restricted abortions were unconstitutional. So abortion deaths rose to the point in 1977 that 1 million babies a year were being aborted. Okay, so let's talk about the actual Equal Rights Amendment, though. What was the issue? What were the sides? Well, the issue was that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied on account of sex, male or female. Okay, so that was the general gist of the amendment. Proponents argued that we needed this as to reinforce our basic rights. Reinforce our basic rights. The opponents, though, argue that it's already in there. It's already in the US Constitution, so we just need to enforce what's already there. And their second argument for the opponents was that it would remove some protections that women currently have. For example, the military draft. Women are currently not subject to the military draft. They are free to join the military, but are not subject to the draft as men are. It did fail to get the ratification it needed. It needed 38 states, and by its deadline, which all amendments have a deadline, it was 35 states. So it came just 3 short. However, 5 states that had approved it suddenly changed their minds in the following days. So they revoked their approval. All right, another domestic difficulty that started in the Ford presidency was the gay rights movement. Some of the things they wanted to see were the removal of legal prohibitions for practicing homosexuality. Many states at this point had laws that made it illegal to practice homosexuality. They also wanted to be able to marry their same-sex partners. And it was all presented as a struggle for freedom, very similar to the civil rights movement. But it was very different, and it should be always viewed that way. African Americans deserve equal treatment under the law. The color of your skin should have nothing to do with it. But sexual orientation is not the same thing, okay? This is a choice that they make, not something that is biological, but they have made it appear to be something that is not a choice, that they were born that way. Okay, so the Bible clearly states that homosexuality is a sin, and it also teaches that God ordained marriage to be one man and one woman. Okay, we're going to drop that and move on to President Carter. In the 1976 election, Ford was the unelected incumbent. He had not been chosen by the people of the whole United States. Therefore, he had never run for nationwide office before, but he was still the incumbent. Many Republicans favored his opponent, which was Ronald Reagan. Yeah, Reagan ran for president in 1976 and he was not successful, obviously. Ford won that nomination by a very narrow margin. Um, so he does not have the favor of the Republican Party as a whole behind him. He has about half of them, and that's it. Um, Jimmy Carter won the Democratic nomination. He was running as an outsider. He'd really not ever held that much public office. He had been the governor of Georgia, was the biggest office he had ever held. He was a peanut farmer from Georgia. I think it's down near Athens, is where he originally came from. He aimed for the political center, trying to appeal to all of his party and other people as well by not really taking big sides one way or the other. And it really looked like he was going to win easily because Ford was so out of favor with the general population. But actually, Carter won the closest presidential election since 1916. So in 60 years, we had not had a presidential election that close. In fact, I saw in your book, he had 50.1% of the popular vote. And of course, that doesn't matter what was the count in the Electoral College. Excuse me. It was 297 to 240. So it was very, very close. So let's talk about Carter as a president. He tried to be a people's president and give this down home image. In fact, he got out of the limousine for the inaugural parade and walked the parade route, just trying to appeal to the general population, like I'm just a normal guy just like the rest of you. He appointed many women and minorities to positions of power in his administration. And this helped him appeal to a wider range of people as well. He also, one of his most unpopular decisions, offered amnesty to draft dodgers from Vietnam. It was not a popular move for him, and it caused him to be viewed as an ineffective leader, as well as the fact that he was a micromanager. He wanted to know all the details and be able to make the decisions himself. And that is not the job of a president. In fact, I think it's probably one of the things our current president does most effectively is he is not a micromanager. He appoints people he can trust, and then he lets them do their job. But Carter also did not work well with Congress, and all of these things contribute to him being seen as an ineffective leader. He had a very, very bad I have the hiccups, approval rating while he was president. Foreign affairs, though, are where he truly pursued greatness as a president. His main concern in all foreign affairs that he did was human rights. And this is what the Carter Foundation, even today, is known for, is promoting human rights around the world, that all men truly are created equal in the eyes of God. But because of his pursuit of human rights, he found it very difficult to influence communist nations because communist nations really don't care about human rights. Okay, another thing that he did was he finished the Panama Canal Treaty. This had been started under Nixon and Ford. So it was really the completion of a long process of turning the Panama Canal back over to the Panamanians. It narrowly passed in the Senate because it was so controversial. We didn't want to give it up, but it needed to be done, or that's what Carter thought. And so he did that. And in 1999, not during his presidency, but years later, the control of the canal was turned back over to the Panamanians, and that has been completed. He also is very well known for the Camp David Accords. And if you go to his library here in Atlanta, his presidential library is downtown, you'll see that he is I think this is probably what he is most proud of from his years as president. What he did was he basically brought Egypt and Israel to the bargaining table. These two countries, when Israel was created in 1948, Egypt attacked them the very next day. And they've been at each other since then, since 1948. But in the Camp David Accords, Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist, and that was huge. Israel, in return, gave back the Sinai Peninsula, that little triangle that juts down right to the right of Egypt and the left of Israel. Israel had control of that Sinai Peninsula. They had won it in the 6-Day War, in which they had defeated Egypt. But they returned that property, that plot of land, to Egypt for them to be in control of. Anwar Sadat was the president of Egypt that negotiated that. Menachem Begin was the leader of Israel at the time. Anwar Sadat was actually executed very shortly, was assassinated shortly after his signing of the Camp David Accords. But it really was a great achievement for President Carter. He also worked with the Soviet Union to sign a second SALT treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. He signed this in June of 1979. He's going to have to run for election in a year, so it's a tough place to be, but it was a tough challenge in the Senate. And he actually ended up withdrawing the treaty from consideration in December because it had not passed yet, and because the Soviets at that point invaded Afghanistan, and he didn't want to make a treaty with the Soviet Union when he no longer believed that he could trust them. He couldn't trust them before, but he was being naive at that point. Okay, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, he did place an embargo on the sale of grain to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was heavily dependent on American grain to feed its people. He also boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics. At this point in history, both the Summer and Winter Games were competed in the same year. So they weren't done in off seasons like they are now. So we were going to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics. That makes for an interesting story in itself, which I don't have time for right now. He also withdrew from the SALT II treaty, and he proclaimed what he called the Carter Doctrine. In the Carter Doctrine, he said that he would resist by military force if necessary any Soviet attempt to push farther south in the Persian Gulf. Basically, it's very similar to World War II when we told Hitler, no more. You can have that, but don't go any further. That's what he's basically saying here. He's telling the Soviets, okay, you can have Afghanistan, but you can't have any more. Carter's actions brought criticism from all sides. He will not be very successful. But we need to also talk about what happened in Iran, and I hope I have enough time to do this. All right, so Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was a dictator in Iran who was actually not doing too bad, and he was actually friendly with the West, with America and with the British and other Western European countries. He ended up having to flee Iran in January of 1979 because Iran became so volatile. All right, so when he fled, the Ayatollah Khomeini took over. He was a fanatical Islamic extremist. Pahlavi was a member of, I believe it was, hold on just a second, the Sunni Muslims. Khomeini is a Shiite. Khomeini referred to America as the Great Satan. That was his terminology. So after the Shah, who was the first guy I mentioned, was allowed to enter the United States, he fled Iran. He didn't come immediately here, but he later decided to come here because he needed medical treatment. But after he came to the United States, the Khomeini was behind, Ayatollah Khomeini was behind the taking of